Hey everybody, welcome to Cowboy Criminology. Of course, I am your host, Derek Judd, the Cowboy Criminologist. So I want to apologize. I had a great serial killer Saturday video uh, all planned out, ready to go. And as I was sitting there Friday evening and I was getting it edited and I was getting ready to get it put on, I didn't realize that about halfway through the second part of the video, I completely lost my microphone. And I was completely unable to get any usable audio from it. And so instead of trying to splice in the stuff that I had and losing consistency in the video and everything, I just decided to go ahead and reshoot it. It was a very frustrating experience, but you know what? Lesson learned about knowing your equipment, right? So, y'all, we're up to 166 new subscribers. We've got almost 8,900 views on the channel, which is absolutely terrific, and I can't thank y'all enough. I love the comment section of this channel because I like having that interaction and that kind of back and forth, and I think y'all do such a great job in helping me and helping kind of guide where the channel's going, and also you help me with ideas. And please feel free to comment and leave a comment, and I'll try to get back to you in the comment section if it's something that can be answered fairly quickly. Great, but sometimes y'all ask really in-depth questions, and I think that they require a little more explanation, which gets them put into a video. So, like I said, this was originally intended to be a serial killer Saturday, so you kind of get a bonus with this one. It's a really fun video. I really enjoyed working on this one. But before we get into that, I want to back up to Saturday before last, where we talked about fair and wardrobe, and one of the questions came from my dad, and we were talking on the phone, and he said, "Hey, you know, I was watching the video," and he goes, "I have a question for you." I said, "Okay," and he goes, "Was fair and wardrobe a preferential offender, or were these victims of opportunity?" And he said, and his reason for asking is you had mentioned their height all being around 5 foot tall, and you had mentioned that you wanted to know more about his wife in relation to her height because of how Fair and Wardrip told detectives after he was arrested that when he was killing these women, he was seeing his wife's face, and it was his wife that he was attacking, and his wife that he was fighting. And so that's a great question because it does beg a little further explanation. Okay, now keep in mind that Fair and Wardrip is a mixed type serial killer, and as a mixed type serial killer, his killings are born more out of stressors in his life. So we talked about some of those: money, relationships, family issues, work issues, job security, loss of love, loss of relationship, loss of job, those type of things. When those things creep up, when those stressors are prevalent, a mixed type serial killer is more likely to act out. Now, as a mixed type offender, he's also not really planning to kill anybody. And that's why with a mixed type offender, you tend to have that how am I trying to put this? Those organized and disorganized traits. So disorganized in the fact that he uses whatever weapon of opportunity or his own size and strength against his victims. But then on the other side, he's also careful enough not to leave a whole bunch of evidence around. All right. And that is very very quintessential of the mixed typology. serial killer, and it also lets you know that one way you can tell a mixed typology, or one big clue, is that when you see those organized and disorganized traits kind of clash head on, it tells you you're not dealing with a terribly sophisticated offender. Most of your mixed and disorganized type offenders are not going to be overly intelligent, usually average intelligence or below. And I think we talked about Farron Wardrip as being an average intelligence, or maybe I found that out later. But there was nothing spectacular. He wasn't an Ed Kemper type with a really high IQ or anything like that. Uh, but when you see those things that are those organized and disorganized traits, you can pretty much plan on this being a victim of opportunity. Uh, in fact, between the intravenous drug use and the walking around at all hours of the night and the alcohol abuse, one thing or another, he came upon Lisa Boone's home because he lived in the neighborhood. Lisa Boone and Ellen Blau lived just like 2 blocks from each other. In fact, Ellen Blau lived in the same apartment complex that Farron Wardrip lived in. So that kind of makes sense with Ellen Blau, because she would have recognized him as being a neighbor, and, oh, hey, what are you doing? Oh, I'm looking for somebody, and then all of a sudden he takes over. Um, we talked about how Terry Sims' cousin said that he didn't think that she was killed because of who she was, but more likely that she could identify who her attacker was. And I think that's I think that's a spot on observation. Um, with Tina Kimbrough, she had actually befriended Farron Wardrip. They hung out at the same bar where Tony Gibbs happened to hang out, and Tony Gibbs also worked at the same hospital as Farron Wardrip. So even though they share common physical traits, being height, weight, uh, you wouldn't necessarily confuse them with being sisters. Now, going back to that, Deborah Taylor up in the Fort Worth area, another victim of opportunity. Why? He thought that there was going to be some sort of romantic liaison, and that didn't happen. And she was quick to point out that didn't happen. There's our stressor, and that's how everything unfolded with that. So you got to remember, Wichita Falls, especially in the early '80s, wasn't a terribly large town. Okay, so uh, the fact that there is so much overlap between the killer and the victims, don't automatically think preferential. In fact, this is very typical of disorganized and mixed typologies. Is they do tend to kill people uh, who are closer to them or have more of a connection. In fact, had we not really known anything about Farron Wardrip, it would have been pretty easy to put him on a suspect list because there is so much overlap. And I'm trying to remember where I read it, but I think when you're looking for anger excitation, power retaliatory rapist, which power control serial killer under the Holmes de Burger uh, classification would certainly qualify as that. But generally, they live or work within a 3-mile radius of their victims. And generally, the victims are acquaintances or have some tangible connection. So something to think about. And that's not always the case. It certainly wasn't with Richard Trenton Chase, but it is a good place to start. And when you're talking about criminal profiling, which is really what we're doing, what you're doing is playing the numbers. You're looking at what is usually true, and then you take that as your starting point. But you don't ever hang on to it so tight that you lose track of new evidence, new sources of information. You always take it for what it is. A profile has to live and breathe and grow with the investigation. If the profile quits growing, there's either a problem with the profile or there's a problem with the investigation. More likely than not, there's a problem with the profile. I From the first time I was exposed to criminal profiling, which was during the Beltway sniper investigation in 2002, I learned really quick why the FBI's behavioral analysis unit very quickly stopped doing profiles of ongoing investigations unless they were just completely out of leads or all avenues have been explored. Because I remember the Beltway sniper case just went in so many wild directions that it was. I'm not going to say the investigation was bumbled. There's a lot going on, but given where it happened, I think one of the biggest problems was too many politicians were trying to play detective and trying to tell law enforcement how the investigation needed to unfold. And anytime that happens, there are going to be foul ups and there's going to be missteps. And so politicians, stay out of law enforcement. Law enforcement officers, stay out of politics. Very simple. Now, if you're a sheriff or a constable, easier said than done, but if people are electing you because you're a politician, you're a crappy law enforcement officer. But if you're like Sheriff Grady Judd down there in Florida, in Polk County, Florida, and you're getting elected because you're doing the job that you're supposed to do, then you're a law enforcement officer. So Grady Judd, a fantastic job down there. I always love watching your briefings. I just think, man, America would be such a much better place if more sheriffs were like him. He needs to have his own leadership institute is what he needs to do. But anyway, getting back to that. So this whole preferential versus opportunistic dichotomy was actually born completely by accident out of the Ted Bundy investigation. And so much has been made of Ted Bundy's preferences for white, slender, upper middle class females, college students, with their hair parted down the middle. And a lot of that is traced back to a college girlfriend named Stephanie, who happened to fit that bill. But keep in mind, in the 70s in Washington, that would have been the norm, all right? Especially in the neighborhoods he frequented, one thing or another. That victimology type doesn't really tell you a whole lot. The hairstyle doesn't tell you a whole lot, all right? And let me put it to you like this, okay? You see a group of kids and they're hanging out on a particular side of town and they're all wearing the same style of clothes, name brand, higher end, and they're all wearing hairstyles that are very popular. Now, what was a popular show that was on during this time? The Brady Bunch. You had the whole Marsha Brady, long hair parted down the middle. And if you look at just about every single high school or college yearbook, you are going to find that same hairstyle, that and perms. All right. So there's nothing really unusual about that. And that preferential victim has actually kind of hindered law enforcement in a lot of ways because it's created linkage blindness. Now, most of the time, when we're talking about serial offenders and we're talking about linkage blindness, we're talking jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Now, that can be from city to city, city to county, city to state, whatever. As soon as the crime crosses jurisdictional lines, that's what we start to think of with linkage blindness. But modus operandi, remember, modus operandi grows and changes with the type of the offender. Now, an organized offender probably not going to change their MO quite so much, because once they find something that works for them, they're going to stick to it. Mixed typology offender, like I said, they're opportunistic. So you might have strangulation, shooting, stabbing, and all that be attributed to the same offender, but that's where you got to go back to your victimology. Disorganized offender, the MO is going to change case for case, and with a disorganized offender, signature is going to be your best bet of linking the crimes. Okay, but that's kind of the problem, is people will look at a crime and say, well, these two aren't connected, without really giving it a fair shake. Okay, so it's if something happens, it is if you have a serial offense, even if it's two homicides that appear to have no real connection, maybe it's worth sitting down with another investigator and sitting there and saying, okay, what do these have in common? What do they not have in common? Okay, maybe you can't link them together. Maybe they're not part of the same series, but while your investigation is going forward, why not keep that in the back of your brain, just in case they do end up being connected, and that way nothing gets dropped. All right. Another comment was made that Fairmore Drip was the first time. Cool Brader, I'm pretty sure this is you. If not, please correct me. But that this is the first time you'd heard of a serial killer who didn't have a signature. Okay. Signatures are a lot like the preferential victim. All right. It kind of started with some very obvious signatures. And the way of thinking of signature, it's the psychological compulsion of somebody to act in a certain way. It's something that's not needed for the crime to be successful. In fact, in a lot of ways, you run the risk of getting caught. But there is something about this particular act that is part of the fantasy. And whatever that fantasy is, that signature is going to be a part of it. And so sometimes you really have to take a hard look at the type of crime, your victim, all of these things in order to determine what is MO and what is signature. But signature is not always there. How the crime was committed, the MO, that's always going to be there. But a signature may not always be there. So let's take another mixed type offender, Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. Okay, he was somebody who started to believe his own press, and yes, he was involved in satanic worship after reading the Satanic Bible written by Anton LaVey, and his signature was the inverted pentagram drawn on the walls of his victims' homes in blood. And that's not really unusual for a mixed offender to do something like that. The lipstick killer, Heinrich Ahrens, was a lot like that, with scrolling the message on the wall. But I think he was Ahrens was more of a mixed typology moving towards organized, because I think he was starting to get a real feel for what he was doing, and I think it scared him. All right. But with Ramirez, the more he started to get away with everything, the more he started to delve into that fantasy that, the devil was protecting him, and that's the reason he wasn't getting caught. And depending on how you view the situation, in the Ramirez case, law enforcement either had the absolute best timing or absolute worst timing, because they showed up just as Ramirez was fixing to get catch a beat down from an entire East LA neighborhood. All right. An organized offender or a disorganized offender, Richard Chinton Chase is probably the quintessential disorganized offender with the signature. His signature was the blood drinking. All right. Happened after the victims were dead. He drank from the fresh wounds. He ate some yogurt, used the yogurt cup to scoop out the blood and drink it. So you might say, okay, well, how is that signature? Okay. The blood drinking is the signature. Okay. And when you have a disorganized scene, and this would be disorganized, you'd look at it and it would appear on first sight to the investigator to be incredibly chaotic. You just kind of look around, you're like, whoa, it's like somebody put a chainsaw on a helicopter blade and it just spun around, because there's no rhyme, there's no reason, there's no organization. All right. But the blood drinking, once you can determine that blood drinking has happened, that tells you right away you are probably dealing with somebody who is experiencing some type of psychological disconnect, psychological break, or is suffering from psychosis. Okay. And so that's kind of what made Robert Ressler's profile, absolutely legendary in this case. And one day I'm going to dedicate a video just to the Richard Chinton Chase profile. Because it has become an absolute legend. It's kind of like the James A. Brussels profile of the Mad Bomber, New York City, just after the Depression. His profile was profoundly accurate too. But once you understand what they were seeing, what they were looking at, it makes perfect sense. It's almost like, why would you look for anybody else? So always think about that. And when you think about a disorganized scene and you have missing body parts, or you can see blood drinking, things like that, you can move to that. You can move to that logical presumption that you're dealing with somebody who is extremely mentally ill. All right. But let's see here. Dennis Rader, ultimate organized serial killer, right? A lot of times, the signature, you may not even realize it's a signature until you're conducting the investigation. You have a suspect, and you serve that search warrant on their property, or their car, or their cabin, or their work, whatever. But with BTK, of course, he named himself, which kind of tells you a lot about his inadequacies and how he saw himself, and he wanted to be powerful and feared, which, hey, mission accomplished. He had the Wichita Overland Park area of Kansas just absolutely terrified. But it was the drawings of his crime scene, and they were so specific and so exact to the individual crime scenes, the Otero family and things like that, that it wasn't just the positioning of the bodies, and it wasn't just the location of the bodies. He even went so far as to be able to draw the knots specifically the way they were tied. And he became a collector. He photographed, he took driver's licenses and stuff like that. And so the whole the elaborate setup of the crime scenes is what was the signature aspect of BTK. And of course, when you can compare the knots, that is a huge component of that. And of course, bondage was a theme, and so much a theme in his mind that he named himself BTK. So I think the easiest way to think of MO and signature, MO is what helps you commit the crime. Signature is what helps get you caught. Okay, so let's. John Douglas did this as an exercise when he was explaining it to in road schools and at the FBI Academy. And he's trying to clear up the difference. And he says, okay, so take 2 bank robbers, and each bank robber goes into a bank. Okay, the first bank robber, he goes in, and as he's getting the money, he has everybody take off their clothes. And the clothes are stuffed into a trash bag. And I'm paraphrasing. I don't remember 100% how this went, but he takes their clothes, they're naked, and he binds them all together, lays them down on the floor facing each other. Okay? How is that MO? Well, while he's doing that, he's humiliating, he's degrading his victims, but he's also keeping them focused on being incredibly uncomfortable. And I think being stripped down to your underwear in a room full of complete strangers would make most of us uncomfortable. If you're not, you're probably an exhibitionist, and that's a different video on a completely different channel. But that is a way that would actually help him escape, because people are more focused on being their level of discomfort and what's happening than they are about trying to remember small details about him. Okay? So now you take a second bank robber, and the second bank robber comes in, and in the bank he robs, he strips everybody down. But in this case, he binds them together in sexually provocative poses, and he takes pictures of them. Why would he do that? The cops are coming, the silent alarm's triggered, all of these things are happening. Why does he take the time to do that? That could get him caught. Okay? The signature is usually the element of fantasy that the offender can't control. Okay? So while the bank robbery, so in this case, you could actually look at it as, by binding them together, taking photographs, all of these things, you could actually say that the signature was more important than the actual crime. Okay, so in the first case, bank robbery was the motive, and keeping the people tied up, looking at each other, was his way of helping prevent himself from being identified. In this case, getting the money was the pretext to getting everybody to strip down, posing them in sexually provocative positions, and taking pictures. Okay, this allowed him. This was the fantasy. This was the whole thing. Richard Trenton Chase, he needed blood because he thought that he was being poisoned. His blood was turning into dust, and by checking up for unlocked doors, he was able to go in, and he figured that he was welcome to do whatever he wanted. And so I don't necessarily think he wanted to kill, but I think he felt compelled to kill because he had to replenish his blood. So signature will tell you a lot about the type of offender you're dealing with. Okay? So, y'all, thank you so much. Those were great questions. I had a lot of fun with those. Serial Killer Saturdays, I really do enjoy that feature. I enjoy all the videos I put up, but Serial Killer Saturdays just kind of, I love getting into, I love finding the why, and if I can't find the why, I want to know how. So anyway, while I was looking for ideas for what was supposed to be last week's Serial Killer Saturdays, I found this. React videos are really common on YouTube, and I always like watching professionals react to things I'm interested in, whether that's guitar playing, flying, law enforcement, court cases, things like that. I always find those interesting because I always enjoy a different take on things. And I was like, hey, you know what? With Serial Killer Saturdays, I think the subscribers, the people who watch regularly, are getting an idea for criminal profiling and what serial killers are or are not. And I said, I think it'd be cool to find somebody with a knowledge of criminology to go through and look at some serial killers in movies and talk about, how realistic they are or aren't. And a couple of videos I found were either psychologists or psychiatrists, and they were reacting, and I wasn't impressed. And that's not to say that there was anything wrong, but the difference between a forensic psychologist or psychiatrist or criminologist looking at serial killers or looking at a crime is we don't care about the underlying organic cause or what it's going to take to rehabilitate this individual or make them better. We don't care. We just want them to stop the crimes they're committing because they're awful. And one of the individuals I watched, he kept referring to everybody as being a psychopath. And psychopath really isn't a term that's used a whole lot more or a whole lot anymore. But even when psychopath was a well-known term, a psychopath is not I mean, we're all capable of violence. I mean, let's just be honest. Like any other creature on the planet, we can be moved towards violence. But with the psychopath thing, you look at most of your Fortune 500 CEOs, you look at your successful entrepreneurs, a lot of those guys would be considered psychopath. They don't have empathy for people. They'll use people superficially to get what's best for them or what they want. Now, a sociopath, on the other hand, that's something different. A sociopath has a lot of the same proclivities that a psychopath has, but they're more likely to respond to violence. As a matter of fact, while both psychopathic and sociopathic personalities are rare, a sociopathic personality is even more rare than psychopath. I think less than 1% of the population could be considered to be sociopathic, and only about 4% of the population could be considered to be psychopathic. So, if you want something to help make you sleep a little better at night, there you go. But just because somebody is classified as psychopathic or sociopathic does not mean that they're actually going to be violent. Do they have a higher percentage that they may engage in violence or risk-taking behavior? Yeah, absolutely. With a psychopath, they're going to step on everybody to get what they want. And with a sociopath, they're going to do whatever they want because it's right for them, and nothing else matters. An example of a sociopath would be the guy on the motorcycle doing 130 miles an hour with a passenger on the back, whipping in and out of traffic, jumping on and off the highway, splitting lanes, going onto the shoulder, running from the police. That would be an example of that, because they're just out having a good time. And, well, what if your passenger gets hurt? Well, they knew the risk when they got on with me. All right. So very, very little empathy, but very little empathy for the people in their crosshairs. Okay. So just something to think about. But I found this criminologist, and I had never heard of him before. His name's David Wilson. And like I said, I had never heard of him before. But the video clip starts with him looking at the guy who played Ed Kemper in Netflix's show Mindhunters, which I don't know why all the garbage on Netflix, and they decided not to do any more Mindhunters. I thought it was a great show. They were really building up to something with Dennis Rader, who's never identified, but I mean, if you're familiar at all with the BTK case, you know who he is. But anyway, so I found this guy, and I was like, you know what? I want to see if we're looking at these serial killers the same way. So this is David Wilson. This is an interview with Vanity Fair from a couple years ago, and it had like over 7 million views. and it's a great video, and I'll put the link in there. But I just kind of want to go through this with you and just kind of see where the Cowboy Criminologist and criminologist David Wilson agree and disagree. So let's take a look at the video.
I ate his liver with some fava beans and a nice Chianti.
I've never encountered a serial killer who would behave quite so much in that pantomimic way. I have encountered serial killers who've tried to scare me, but I wouldn't be scared by Anthony Hopkins. I'd have laughed, frankly, if he had told me about fava beans and a nice Chianti. Hi, my name is David Wilson. I research, write about, and work with people who've committed violent crimes, specifically murder and serial murder. Today, we're going to be breaking down clips from TV shows and movies about serial killers. This scene is from Zodiac.
Don't get up. I want her to tie you up. Okay.
What's interesting about this clip is that you begin to see one of the basic original FBI binary classifications that serial killers are organized or they're disorganized. By organized, we simply mean that the serial killer brings with him those things which he's going to need to incapacitate his victims. So in this scene, the Zodiac killer brings with him rope. He's wearing gloves, he's masked. Usually we would also say that if you're an organized serial killer, that will imply, for example, that you're employed, that you've got a higher intelligence, that you're sexually competent, that you're able to drive a car. The other aspects of organization that we see in this particular clip is just how much control the serial killer has over his victims. Serial murder as a phenomenon, in my experience, always starts from a sexual fantasy. And I think we've got some of that sexual fantasy in this particular clip around bondage, being powerful.
Okay. So we talked about signature, okay? Signature ties back to the fantasy. The fantasy is the key. Once you can unlock what the fantasy is, or when you can pinpoint the fantasy, you can really start to dive into what's important to the offender. Now, David Wilson is talking about the bondage aspect of this, okay? But I think it's also important, and Zodiac did an excellent job recreating the case as it actually happened. Because if you're familiar with the Zodiac case, this plays out with a frightening amount of accuracy. But one of the things I want you to remember is that Zodiac had the female half of his victims tie up the male half. Now, why is that? Well, one of the things is we talk about how serial killers are notoriously inadequate people, okay? And by having the woman tie up the man, he's taking away the protector. And this is not only self-aggrandizing to Zodiac, but it's humiliating, emasculating, not just for the male half to be tied up by a woman. And so I think bondage plays a significant role in the psyche of Zodiac.
In control. Not only is he masked and wearing gloves, he's also wearing black clothing. He's also got a symbol on his black clothes. All of these things are about instilling fear in his victims. It's also about how he can make his fantasy real. He's fantasized about what he's going to do for a very long period of time. I always say that nobody wakes up overnight and decides that they're going to be a serial killer. A serial killer is a long time in the making. This is
so. I love that he said that. I don't know how many times once people tend to find out that I'm a walking encyclopedia of serial killers, I always get some idiot who sits there and says, I could be a serial killer. Okay, Probably not something an actual serial killer is going to brag about, but okay. And so they'll tell me, how heartless they are and how cruel they are in one thing or another. And so I'll just go back to the McDonald triad. Enuresis, which is wetting the bed well into your teens, cruelty to animals, and fire starting. If I'm lucky, I will get 2 out of the 3. And now the McDonald triad is prevalent in a frighteningly high number of serial killers. And while it still has its detractors, I still think it's a good jumping off point for trying to figure out whether somebody exhibits these dark triad traits that would lead towards either borderline or antisocial personality disorder. And once I explain that to people, it's like, yeah, you could turn around and you could have a bad day and you could become a mass killer maybe, but you're never going to become a serial killer. You don't have the fantasy, you don't have the underlying desire to go out and just hurt people for no reason. And most mass killings are retributive in nature. They're trying to you'll see in a lot of your mass killings, your mass shootings, they're injustice collectors. Either the location, the people, or what the location represents has offended them, affronted them in some way, and it's their way of taking revenge. All right. Mass killers, especially with mass shooters, are notoriously inadequate. I think the only one I haven't really been able to pin down, because he's such an outlier, is Stephen Paddock, and of course he was the Mandalay Bay shooter back in October of 2017. So just something to think about when you're trying to understand these types of behaviors.
Simply a way that he now wants to make the fantasy become real. Once they've engaged in the fantasy once or twice, it's no longer fantastic. And therefore, the sorts of things they'll do within the crime scene will become more bizarre, more exaggerated, more extreme.
Okay, that is a fantastic point about that. So all of these serial, especially in more of your organized offenders, there is a fantasy that the offender is trying to make real. And the problem is that fantasy and reality never meet. And even riding the wild high of the very first time, the very first kill, falls short of the fantasy. And they start thinking, oh, I should have done this. I should have done this. I should have spent more time here, less time here. And it's an entire thought process that the offender is going through to try and make the fantasy and the reality mix, come together. But that's the thing, is that always falls short. And so you will begin to see, after the first 1 or 2 crimes, you will start to see an escalation of the signatory behavior. You will start to see more of what a higher level of violence, and you might see in a case where a serial killer attacks a male and female couple, you may see that there is less time spent with the male victim and more time spent with the female victim, meaning that the male victim is killed very quickly while the female member is killed in a more ritualistic fashion, I guess is the best way to say it.
It's interesting that he also brings a gun, but he chooses not to use the gun initially. He ties his victims up. He's going to threaten them with the knife. This is the difference between those serial killers who are act-focused and those serial killers who are process focused. The act focused serial killer simply wants to kill his victims. End of. Bang, they're dead. The process focused serial killer is interested in extending the length of time that he has with his victims. He wants to tie them up. He wants to see the fear that they're experiencing. He wants certain words to be spoken. He wants them to plead for their lives before he kills them. That actually makes him feel sexually powerful, sexually in control, to be the person that he wants to be.
Get on your stomach so I can tie your feet.
We hear the flatness in the Zodiac killer's voice.
I'm taking your car. I'm going to Mexico.
That is often characteristic of an underlying personality trait called psychopathy, an inability to show empathy, to show sympathy, to walk in another person's shoes.
It gets really cold out here at night. We could freeze.
Of course, we see the male victim in this scene trying to engage in conversation. In my experience of working with serial murderers, they are simply not interested in that kind of rapport. They don't want to see you as being another human being. Usually they're psychopaths, and therefore they can't.
Now, this is the first thing he said that I disagree on. And keep in mind, he could have had training in a different time, different era. But you will not find psychopathy or even sociopathy, psychopathic personality disorder or sociopathic personality disorder in the DSM, at least not anymore. Now it's been replaced by borderline personality to describe a psychopath and antisocial personality to describe a sociopath. When you have, like I said before, when you have somebody who shows a propensity for violence, you're most likely dealing with an antisocial personality disorder. And I think that's more prevalent here in the Zodiac, especially when you take into account the hood and the black clothing and stuff like that. But going back to inadequacy, when you see the mix, okay, so he's got a firearm with him. But who's that for? Well, it's not really for anybody. It's in case he can't control the victims, he has a quick way of dispatching them without worrying about any harm to himself. It's a very powerful thing to, if you have a gun pointed at you, your natural instinct is comply, comply, comply. So, very, very interesting, but also very telling about how this offender thinks of himself, thinks of his victims.
And walk in your shoes. They don't care about your suffering. In fact, your suffering is actually what they're seeking to do. Next up is a fictional serial killer called Dexter.
Absolutely.
You're mine now, so do exactly as I say.
Dexter fits a type of serial killer called the mission-orientated serial killer. He's a serial killer who's on a mission to rid the world of other serial killers. And that's very typical.
We talked about that type of serial killer, and we talked about that in the Holmes and DeBurger typology of serial killers, but we haven't talked about one who's mission driven on Serial Killer Saturdays. But there's a lot of things that the show Dexter gets right about serial killers, and a lot of things they get wrong. Take that artistic license. But one of the small details I thought about was when David Reyes, I think that's his name, he calls Dexter Morgan, he keeps calling him socio. And apparently that's like a term of endearment, kind of like cousin or something like that. It implies somebody closer than a friend. But it's also short for sociopath, which, like we've talked about, uh, is a precursor to antisocial personality disorder and displays a propensity for violence. But yet nobody looks at Dexter and sees that. And that attention to detail is why I think the show was so great.
Of a number of actual serial killers criminologically.
Trust me, I definitely understand. See, I can't help myself either. Children, I could never do that. Not like you. Never. Ever. Kids.
He establishes very quickly that there's some kind of moral hierarchy in the phenomenon of serial murder. Of course, there's no such thing as a moral serial killer. Everybody who takes another person's life is, by the very nature of the fact, immoral. In Dexter, we've got the ultimate organized serial murderer. He has a garrote that he's able to control his victim. Ultimately, he's going to inject his victim so that he becomes paralyzed. Dexter has a very elaborate MO and a very unique signature. MO stands for modus operandi. It is the means by which the serial killer or the murderer kills. The MO would change because of how the victim might react, whilst the signature is a particular way that a killer will leave the crime scene that will be unique to that particular individual. Dexter is somebody who's going to torture, and the context for that torture is almost medicalized. He's usually giving poisons, he's in a particular medical room, his kill room. That kind of medicalized signature is not that common in my experience, with one particular caveat. Because of course, a significant number of healthcare professionals have been serial killers.
Okay, so I would tend to disagree about the kill room in itself being the signature. Yes, it's very sterile, and it kind of speaks to his attention to detail and his focus, which you would have in somebody like a blood spatter analysis, like a Dexter Morgan. But for me, the signature aspect is the blood slides. Collecting the blood is very important, and if you're familiar with the show, and it's been off the air, so if you haven't seen it, spoiler, and you can fast forward this part. But he was found in a shipping container with his brother and his mom, and his mother had been torn apart by a couple of guys with a chainsaw, and the shipping container was just filled with blood. And so that collecting the blood, him being a blood spatter analyst, it all ties in. But remember, I also said signature is what gets you caught. And how many times did those blood slides come back to bite him? That need to collect those slides came back to bite him. But that's the fantasy right there, and that's his particular trophy. Yeah, Harold Shipman, Donald Harvey. There have been healthcare and convalescent homes tend to have they tend to be better educated, better trained, and they have a seemingly endless supply of people in their charge who are so ill that it's easy to dispatch of them as an angel of mercy type killer, and that they end up with such a high body count because there seems to be so many medical reasons that rule out anything. So by the time somebody falls under suspicion, they can have tens, sometimes hundreds of victims. And so, when you're thinking about serial killers, let that kind of percolate in your head the next time you go to the hospital to have your appendix removed for the second time. And if you got that joke, thank you. But I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to stop this video for now, and I'm going to come back. I'm going to break this into 2 parts, so it's not too long. But y'all stay tuned. I'll get back to you here with part 2 real soon. All right, take care.